The twilight was painting the skyscrapers of Manhattan with shades of orange and purple, a daily spectacle that very few ever truly paused to appreciate. Inside the Pinnacle, one of New York's most exclusive restaurants, the atmosphere was one of hushed elegance, punctuated by the discreet clinking of silverware and the soft melody of a string quartet. Moving among the polished ebony tables and velvet-upholstered chairs, with an almost invisible grace, was a 24-year-old woman with brown eyes that held a quiet intensity. Her name was Sarah Thompson. To most of the wealthy patrons who frequented the Pinnacle, Sarah was merely part of the impeccable scenery, an efficient and discreet waitress. But beneath her spotless apron and professional smile, an analytical mind simmered, fueled by dreams that extended far beyond tips and the smell of fine dining. She dreamed of candlestick charts, the ebb and flow of the stock market, and the invisible architecture sustaining the city's financial empire. In her small apartment in Queens, after exhausting shifts, she devoured books on finance, watched lectures by investment gurus, and simulated trades on digital platforms, quietly building a knowledge base that most of her clients could never have imagined. On this particular evening, the tension in the restaurant air seemed to coalesce around a specific table, where a 52-year-old man, with impeccably slicked-back grey hair and a custom-tailored suit worth more than Sarah's rent for several months, reigned with unquestionable authority. He was Robert Williams, CEO of Sterling Capital Group, one of Wall Street's most influential and feared names. Robert had a reputation for being a brilliant strategist, but also a man of volatile temper and a colossal ego, forged by decades of victories in the capital markets. His gaze was always one of scrutiny, as if assessing the value of everything and everyone around him. As he sat down, he dismissed the menu with an impatient gesture, and without even looking at Sarah, declared, "Bring me a bottle of Chateau Haut-Brion 2009. I trust you know what you're serving, miss." Robert's voice was deep, carrying an implicit challenge, as if testing her intelligence before she even had a chance to respond. Sarah felt a slight tremor, but maintained her flawless posture. The Haut-Brion 2009. A legendary wine, an exceptional vintage, a symbol of status and deep knowledge for those who truly understood fine wine. It was a power move, she knew, a way for Robert Williams to underscore the social and intellectual distance he presumed existed between them. "Yes, Mr. Williams," Sarah replied with a composure that belied the spark in her eyes. "A Premier Cru Classé from the Pessac-Léognan appellation. The 2009 is a highly acclaimed vintage, noted for its rich concentration, smoky notes, and profound complexity. An outstanding choice, if I may say so." Robert raised an eyebrow, an almost imperceptible movement, yet one that denoted restrained surprise. No one, not even his closest associates, dared to correct him or add unsolicited details. He expected subservience, not competence. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face, quickly replaced by a shrewd curiosity. The evening wore on, and Sarah continued to attend to Robert's table and his guests with silent efficiency. But the seed of curiosity had been planted in the millionaire. As he spoke about the market's highs and lows, the volatility of tech stocks, and the unpredictability of monetary policies, Sarah absorbed every word, every nuance. Her ears were trained not just to catch food orders, but also the whispers of the financial world she yearned to join. At one point, one of Robert's associates commented on the difficulty of predicting the Federal Reserve's next move. Robert, with a dismissive smirk, turned to Sarah, who had just finished refilling his water glass. "Well, since our young waitress seems to have such a refined palate for wine, perhaps she also has insight into the market, doesn't she, miss?" The tone was clearly sarcastic, a veiled jab meant to patronize her. Sarah's blood ran hot for a moment, but she maintained control. This was the moment she'd been waiting for, the opportunity, however small, to make herself heard. She took a deep breath. "Mr. Williams," she began, her voice soft but firm, "my read is that the market has been pricing in a consistently aggressive stance from the Fed, but the latest core inflation data, while concerning, shows pockets of disinflationary pressure. I believe the real surprise will come if the Fed signals an extended pause sooner than anticipated, which could trigger a sharp rotation out of defensive positions and into high beta growth stocks." An abrupt silence fell over the table. Robert's associates exchanged glances, surprised by Sarah's use of market terminology and her confident delivery. Robert Williams, meanwhile, froze, the ironic smile fixed on his face. He scrutinized her with a gaze that seemed to attempt to pierce her soul, searching for the pretense beneath the waitress's facade. The tension was palpable. Robert broke the silence with a dry, scornful chuckle. Fascinating. Truly fascinating. And where does all this knowledge come from, miss? Night classes in economics, or just skimming the finance blogs? Sarah met his gaze without flinching. Self-taught, Mr. Williams, and a tremendous amount of dedication. My goal is to eventually launch my own financial literacy platform, helping people who, like me, weren't born with a seven-figure trust fund. Sarah's honesty was bold, almost reckless, but there was a truth so genuine in her words that it was hard to ignore. Robert, accustomed to dealing with flatterers and competitors, found himself facing something new, unvarnished ambition, a sharp mind in an unexpected place. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms, his eyes still fixed on hers. "All right then. Since you are so ambitious and so well-informed," he said with a challenging tone, "why don't you give me a piece of advice? Some financial counsel, waitress. Something that I, an old Wall Street veteran, might learn." The invitation was a trap, she knew. A chance to stumble, to expose herself, to prove her knowledge was superficial. But it was also the only door that had opened, even just a crack. Sarah met his challenge with her gaze. "If I were to offer advice, Mr. Williams," she replied, with a calmness that radiated confidence, "it would be to seriously reconsider the European renewables sector, specifically green hydrogen technology in the Nordic countries. There is massive long-term regulatory tailwind and a capital-intensive barrier to entry that favors established players, creating asymmetric risk-reward profiles." Robert scoffed again. "Nordic hydrogen? With all due respect, miss, I trade in sectors with immediate liquidity and proven track records." Sarah, however, did not back down. "Immediate liquidity is often an illusion of the late cycle, Mr. Williams. The greatest returns come from identifying structural shifts before they go mainstream. Companies like Green Fuel Energy in Norway are trading at a significant discount to their infrastructure valuation and possess the necessary IP and governmental backing. The capital required is substantial, yes, but the projected annual return over a 15-year horizon is double what the typical mid-cap American utility stock offers today." Robert laughed, but this time there was less scorn and more a kind of reluctant admiration in his voice. He hadn't expected her to not only accept the challenge, but also deepen it with concrete examples and a compelling analysis. His associates, who had initially found the scene amusing, now listened intently. The waitress was either teaching them something or, at the very least, provoking them to think. Sarah was acutely aware that she was walking a tightrope. One mistake, one stutter, and she would be dismissed as a fraud. But the adrenaline surging through her veins was fuel. She saw the glint in Robert's eyes, the same glint that lit up a hunter's eyes when spotting a challenging quarry. She wasn't the prey. She was the challenger, for that instant. The evening stretched on, and the debate between the waitress and the Wall Street magnate continued, over a table set with the remnants of a high-end dinner, with the Haut-Briand 2009 sitting nearly untouched in Robert's glass. He grilled her on global interest rate differentials, the correlation between sovereign bond yields and commodity prices, and the shadow banking crisis in certain Asian emerging markets. For every complex question, Sarah had an answer that was informed, articulate, and most importantly, based on sound financial logic. She didn't just recite data, she interpreted trends, analyzed risks, and proposed strategies. At the end of the evening, as Robert Williams signed the check, a heavy silence hung over the table. He handed her the check folder and said, with a tone that was no longer mocking but one of studied intensity, "I will take your suggestions into consideration, Miss Thompson. I make no promises, but you have intrigued me." There was an acknowledgement, a subtle crack in the millionaire's armor. Sarah simply smiled professionally, but her heart was pounding. She had planted a seed. Robert Williams was not a man who forgot something that intrigued him. Throughout his career, his success had always resided in the ability to identify value where others saw only the ordinary, and that 24-year-old waitress with Wall Street knowledge was, undeniably, an unexpected asset. 3 days after the confrontation at the Pinnacle, Sarah received a phone call. Not from the mater, reprimanding her for inappropriate interaction with a client, but from Robert's personal, unlisted number. The voice that answered, cold and professional, belonged to his executive assistant, Sarah Chen. "Miss Thompson, Mr. Williams would like to meet with you tomorrow at 9:30 a.m. at Sterling Capital Group headquarters. It is a business meeting. Please dress appropriately." The message was an ultimatum, not an invitation. The next day, Sarah found herself entering the glass and steel temple housing Sterling Capital in the heart of the financial district. Her modest black blazer, bought at an outlet store, seemed to scream its humble origin in contrast to the Italian marble and modern art adorning the lobby. She was escorted to the 58th floor, where Robert awaited her in an office that seemed to float above the city, the panoramic view of New York framed by glass walls. The difference between the stuffy restaurant kitchen and the austere silence of that corporate penthouse was jarring, a sharp reminder of the chasm she was trying to cross. Robert was standing by the window, watching the movement of the helicopters. He turned, and there was something different in his gaze. The previous arrogance had transformed into a focused intensity, that of someone who saw potential, no longer just a social obstacle. "Have a seat, Sarah," he said, using her first name for the first time. "I'll get straight to the point. I cross-referenced the numbers you mentioned. Green Fuel Energy has seen a 410% surge in pre-market valuation over the last fiscal year, and Eco Harvest Solutions is up 580%. My internal analysts had dismissed those markets as too niche. Your analysis was prescient, if not perfectly timed." He was not a man of compliments, and the admission was telling. Robert then proposed a 9-month competitively salaried fellowship in Sterling Capital's newly formed Impact Investment and Frontier Capital Division. "Don't misunderstand me," he continued, his voice like basalt. "This isn't charity, it's business. I need someone with a perspective that isn't contaminated by elite business schools, someone who understands the ground floor economy, the retail investor. That's where the next wave of capital is going to originate." Sarah, processing the magnitude of the offer, took a deep breath. "Why me, Mr. Williams? Surely there are formally qualified junior analysts on the street, with degrees from Wharton or Stanford." Robert walked to the desk and leaned back against it. "Because you have nothing to lose and everything to prove. Your motivation is unadulterated, and your knowledge is the result of fierce self-discipline. That can't be taught in $50,000 MBAs. I need your sharp insight, your ability to connect dots that most of my staff miss because they've never had to worry about rent being due." Robert's frankness was brutal yet honest. He was offering an opportunity she would never have gained through traditional channels, but he was also in a way exploiting her own history. Sarah hesitated. Accepting meant burning bridges, abandoning her secure job at the pinnacle, and throwing herself into a world where she would be viewed as an imposter by almost everyone. "What about the ethical question, Mr. Williams?" she asked, challenging him again. "Is your interest in capturing the next wave of mass investment or in genuinely empowering the small investor?" Robert managed a rare smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Both. Profit is the measure of success. But in my business, long-term success requires trust. We need to build products that are genuinely beneficial for those you call people like me. You will be the conscience, Sarah. My reality check." The meeting concluded with a firm handshake and a promise. Sarah would report directly to Robert and work on a highly confidential project aimed at democratizing access to high-yield, alternative investments. In the weeks that followed, Sarah's life became a blur. She traded her apron for borrowed suits and spent her evenings deep diving into financial regulations and corporate balance sheets. At the office, she was met with skepticism. Her colleagues, many 20 years her senior and with impeccable academic pedigrees, barely disguised their disdain for the CEO's waitress. Sarah, however, used their disdain as fuel. Her focus was absolute. On one particularly tense afternoon, Robert summoned her for a one-on-one meeting. He was visibly agitated, tossing a report onto the table. "My traditional analysis team cannot understand why I insist on reallocating $30 million to a fund focused on small-scale community development banks. They argue the projected return is too meager and the overhead risk too substantial." Sarah, who had spent the week analyzing the same fund, approached the desk. "Mr. Williams, they are focusing solely on the immediate profit metric. What they ignore is patient capital. The Community Impact Fund has significant governmental backing, a built-in base of long-term committed investors, and critically, a brand narrative that in the long run outweighs short-term profit volatility. In a world where millennials and Gen Z value purpose over quarterly earnings, the social return is the new financial return. Robert looked at her for a long moment, the irritation giving way to something that resembled reflection. "You speak of patient capital. Where did you pick that up?" Sarah offered a slight, humble smile. "From financial literacy podcasts and free online courses, sir. There is a very rich ecosystem of free knowledge out there, if you know where to look. Accessibility is the key, not the price point." The mention of free online courses and accessibility seemed to strike Robert in an unexpected way. He leaned back, his expression shifting to one of subtle melancholy, the same one Sarah had briefly glimpsed in the restaurant. "There was a time," Robert began, his voice low, almost inaudible, "when I didn't need expensive degrees or reports to know what was valuable. I trusted my gut, my knowledge built from the ground up. I had a partner, a collaborator who constantly reminded me of that very principle. The revelation coming from such a private man was jarring." Sarah realized that Robert's intense interest in her was deeper than a new market strategy. It was personal. There was a history of loss and an echo of the past that she, with her pure ambition and humble origins, seemed to have awakened. The true turning point in Robert's project was not the democratization of investment, but the search for a piece of his own past. A reflection of a person he had lost and who represented the integrity he feared he had sacrificed for success. If you are following this journey of perseverance and ambition, and you want to see how Sarah's world continues to intersect with Robert Williams's, make sure you are subscribed to the channel. Stories like this remind us that determination is the greatest asset we can possess. And now I want to hear from you. What do you think is the fundamental difference in perspective between Robert and Sarah at this moment, beyond the financial gulf? Share your insightful reflection in the comments. Your opinion might be more valuable than a Wall Street analyst's report. The pressure at Sterling Capital intensified, and with it, Sarah's isolation. Robert, though protective of her in the workplace, maintained a professional distance, almost fearful of crossing an invisible boundary. The unspoken absence of his sister, hinted at in Block 2, hovered like a ghost in the executive suite. It was Sarah Chen, Robert's assistant, who occasionally offered Sarah small crumbs of information, noting the similarity between the young woman's grit and the energy of the other one. The key to Robert's past came one chilly evening when Robert and Sarah, working late on a crucial presentation for the board, paused for coffee. Robert was uncharacteristically tense. "The board will despise the risk," he muttered, looking out at the glittering lights of downtown New York. "They've always hated anything that doesn't fit the traditional models." Sarah, sensing his momentary vulnerability, took a risk. "You mentioned a partner, Mr. Williams. Someone who reminded you to stay connected to the base. Who was she?" Robert rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture of discomfort. "My younger sister, Emily. She was the light of the family. Not the financial whiz I was, but she had a perfect moral compass. She made me promise that when I conquered Wall Street, I would use my power to undo the bad, as she called it." Emily earned her degree in social work and was planning a micro-loan program for low-income entrepreneurs back in our hometown in rural Oklahoma. Robert paused, and the pain in his eyes was palpable. "She passed away in a car accident 22 years ago, driving back from a fundraising event. She was only 29. I failed her. I buried myself in work, became who I became, to prove her sacrifice wasn't in vain. But in the process, I lost sight of her, and I lost sight of who I was." The confession was a shock to Sarah. The Robert Williams she knew was a financial titan. The story he told was one of a grieving brother, shaped by tragedy and guilt. Sarah's determination, her humble background, and her ambition to help the small investors were a mirror of Emily's unfinished mission. That moment was the true resolution of the central conflict. It was no longer about money or power, but about rediscovery and redemption. The presentation to the board took place the following week. Robert, instead of dominating the room as usual, surprised everyone by yielding the spotlight to Sarah. He introduced her as the voice of the new capital wave and the architect of a new market approach. Sarah, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that now fit her perfectly, with the confidence of someone who knew her subject matter, presented the project brilliantly. She avoided complex jargon, using simple, powerful language focused on long-term impact and growth potential, utilizing real-world case studies of entrepreneurs Robert would never have even looked at before. The senior, skeptical board members attempted to destabilize her with aggressive questioning, but Sarah stood firm. At one point, a director tried to force her to choose between pure financial return and social impact. Sarah met his gaze with the same intensity she had used at the pinnacle. "Sir, in 2025, social impact is financial return. Sustainability and equity are not fads. They are the foundations for robust growth. The real risk is ignoring the needs of a demographic that holds the largest untapped capital reserve." She wasn't just defending the project, she was defending her own life story. The board voted to approve. Sarah and Robert's project was greenlit, but the victory was more than professional. She had forced Robert to confront his guilt and honor the promise he made to his sister, using his immense power for a cause greater than personal profit. After the meeting, Robert approached Sarah. "You are extraordinary," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "You wouldn't let me forget who I was, and you gave me the gift of finally fulfilling the promise I made to Emily." The distance between them had vanished, replaced by mutual respect and a deep emotional connection. That moment sealed a new beginning. Robert, for the first time in years, was free from paralyzing guilt, and Sarah had earned her place not by luck, but by her own intelligence and perseverance. He no longer saw her as a substitute for Emily, but as a soul partner in the life project they now shared. The epilogue of the story unfolds several months later, as Sarah and Robert are on a business trip to visit one of Sterling Capital's new microloan funds, ironically, in the same region of Oklahoma where Emily had dreamed of working. They walk in a field, observing the progress of a solar energy startup funded by the new division. Robert isn't wearing a suit. He's relaxed, and his eyes, once guarded, shine with a renewed sense of purpose. He turns to Sarah. "You know, you said the risk was greater, but the potential return was 10 or 15 times. You were right, not just in the financial return, but in the impact. That's worth more than any Wall Street bonus." Sarah smiles, her hand naturally finding his. The kiss that follows is no longer one of challenge or surprise. It is the certainty of two worlds that have finally merged. The waitress and the millionaire have transformed into partners, united by a shared vision that capital must serve a higher purpose. The story of Sarah and Robert is proof that intellect and drive overcome any social barrier. If you were moved by Sarah's journey and Robert's redemption, come be a part of our community. Subscribe now so you don't miss any of our stories of overcoming and transformation. And to connect even further, tell us in the comments what city in the world you are watching this story from. I want to know how far Sarah's strength has reached. Did you enjoy this video? What major life lesson did you take away from Sarah's courage? Share your biggest takeaway below.